Well, congratulations to the Urban Design Group for getting such a good turnout on another celebratory day. It always seems to a cup final or an England match whenever I come here. So I'm most impressed. I have to get a pink pass myself to get out tonight. I'm going to talk about a couple of master plans and design code projects that we have done in Rotherham and Newhall. And apologies to anybody who's been to either of those places and seen my presentation. I've got at least one face here who has heard both. I want to set out some considerations for design coding, first of all, why it's useful and where it's useful. I'll then go through the Rotherham project, which is a brownfield site, large brownfield site, dense area, centre of the town. It is a housing renewal area, housing pathfinder in part of it. Newhall is an urban extension to Harlow. It's a new town, it's a greenfield site, and there's slightly different considerations when it comes to coding. And then I'm going to draw some conclusions at the end. So why code? First of all, on a major urban design project, I'd like to be many different time frames. Some buildings go up within a year, 2 years, others might be 5 years, others might be a generation. So you're having to address a number of different time frames. Secondly, you're relying on other people and other disciplines to implement the plan and build the scheme. You're probably working across different land ownerships in many cases. You may be working across different political boundaries if it's crossing a parish or local authority boundary. And finally, people change over time. Once you've got your code in place and negotiated with everybody, full public involvement, 5-10 years down the line, or even closer, the adopting engineer changes and it can all unravel. So people change over time, get it documented. So there's a need to communicate a design vision at the outset and a need to bring clarity and certainty as to the requirements. Just by way of a bit of fun, I actually gave a talk in London almost 20 years ago on urban design and design codes, and I had to explain what a design code was. And this morning I went and got out my 35mm slides that I did all those years ago and quickly scanned them in and put it down here just to see if it stands up for scrutiny. So this was the example I gave all those years ago. It's actually a real place. So if you know where this is, shout out. It's actually a bit of a test for you. You should get this within 4 slides, being an urban design audience. So normally on a plan we've got a street pattern. We know where the main nodal points are. We may be focusing in on an area that we want to develop or promote renewal. Big node there on that one. We might be adding to it pedestrian access, key vistas, and 20 years ago, all of a sudden we could put things in 3D. This is a big deal, I guess. AutoCAD 2.06, I think, right? Remember right. So you can add your vistas to it. It starts to get in 3-dimensional form. And by adding codes for build to planes, build to lines, where you want to turn a corner, where a landmark goes. Anybody got it? Slide 5. Had a room of chartered surveyors do mightily better than this. So there's a set of urban design rules there that is controlling the built form. In other words, the term we used at the time was designing part of the city without designing the buildings. If I put some buildings into that, I'd probably give it away, remove a few hidden lines. It's obvious San Marco. So those are the sort of examples I was giving and talking about those years ago. And the techniques have got a little bit more sophisticated since then, but actually that maybe gets over quite quickly to a sceptical audience what you're trying to do with a design code. Not that this audience is sceptical, but a room full of architects, for example, where you're having to justify why design codes. So what to code? I think there's 2 situations. As Ben's alluded to, generic codes, which are a genetic code which might be applied across a whole town, and this would be done without a master plan. I think this has really got limited application, and I think it's a little bit of a concern that LDFs are being prepared with design codes attached. If it's a design code without a master plan, I would call that probably a design guide. There are some applications where it can be used successfully. Both the examples I'm talking about this evening are where there is a regulating plan and the design code attached. And I would dub design codes the working drawings of the master plan. They explain the technicalities of exactly what you want to get built and distinguish between what might be illustrative on a plan and what is mandatory. It's necessary to consider who is controlling the land, the resources available to do a design code. Often local authorities don't have a huge amount of resources to produce a code. Are there urban form issues? What is the size of the land parcel going to be? Are you going down to individual plots, or is it larger tracts of land? We use 3 levels of coding, but slightly different to what Ben has outlined. At the first level, we view it as urban structure. So it is street pattern, the connections, street hierarchy, street alignments. It is largely 2-dimensional, but that street pattern, that movement pattern, is going to also determine land use and density. Obviously the major land use is going to accumulate along the more important roads in the hierarchy. The second level, for us, broadly determine massing. And at this level we get into 3 dimensions: street sections, building frontages, building heights, envelopes, plot series, and these are effectively going to determine entrance positions for buildings, relationships between indoor spaces and the street, overlooking, etc. And the third level we use are detail codes, which might be colour, materials, palettes, architectural detail or not. And I have to say we don't use architectural codes, I think, ever, and I'm not sure that it's on our master plans it's appropriate to control the architecture to that level. And then things that go in the public realm, the engineering of the street furniture, street trees, and so on. So those are 3 levels we work to. In some cases we might just be at level 1, on other sites it might be all 3 levels. On the Rotherham study, the site's outlined in red, quite a large tract of the town. It used to be railway sidings, railway station, but since late Victorian times has been industrial, now largely derelict. Fantastic frontage on the western edge to the River Don. If I can just put that into 3D form, you can see the land falling from the east to your right down to the river. Really very dramatic, but at present it's not possible to walk down to the river frontage, which is rather privatised and a shame. We were asked by Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council as client, plus the Pathfinder area, to encode an urban design, what we call an urban design framework. It wasn't a master plan. The first problem we had with that is to say, well, you can't encode it. It would be a set of general rules. And for this kind of site, where you need to be much more precise about how the buildings are going to fit together, we think you need to devise a master plan. And so that was a step that I take 2 steps back and develop the master plan from the broad urban design framework, and that's the master plan that you can see there. The little cut-out square on the left is showing how one particular block can be subdivided into 4 blocks or 1 large block, depending on the uses. The word master plan has become much misused in recent years. I remember asking Rob Cowan how many uses of the word master plan there were in by design, and I think the answer is none. Master plan was used a lot 20 years ago. It had a bad name as being too rigid, too fixed. We talked about urban design frameworks. All of a sudden master planning is back in and everything is called a master plan. My definition of a master plan is you can only call it that if you're doing it for the gentleman or lady who owns the land or controls the land. Otherwise it's more tactical and needs to be more flexible. So quick overview of the codes. They're colour coded here. On the top level we've got level 1, which is urban form, street pattern. the urban codes controlling massing, and at the third level, the detail codes here controlling materials for buildings and public realm. That's the regulating plan that was produced. So there's a detailed set of graphic standards in that plan that you need to look up on the left. Whether it's a build to line, you've got to build up to it. It's a build within zone. The frontage of the building has to sit within a zone, etc. So you have to follow the graphics, and the graphics need to be fairly precise and clearly explained. So, detail of that. And just a few pages from the code itself. First of all, explaining the different character areas, the vision that evolved out of public involvement events, what the local authority vision is for the area, so you're giving a reason for doing it. This sheet here is showing the different levels of detail. The colours are fading out a bit from the angle I'm at, but they should be in blue, green and a pinky colour, showing the different codes that are being applied. I can come back to that if anybody's interested in that level of detail. So this was adopted on completion as a supplementary planning document. It's only one of the 8 cave projects to be adopted in that way, and is being applied now and used to control development. Just a point about the implementation process of that. There should always be a loop for if anybody challenges the code to revise it. So in this case, if a planning application comes in, I can't point, I've been told to stand on the chalk mark here, but look at the third column along in pale blue. If there's an application where an applicant is saying, we actually want to do something a little bit different, and the first code in our manuals is always, if you want to do something different, maybe you can make a good reason for it. So if they say that, the proposal would come in, application for minor variance, there's then a technical procedure to go through, so the local authority can sanction that, and that may or may not then be approved. Different situation on this greenfield site in a new town. Newhall is on the eastern edge of Harlow. It's that gap there you see in the urban form, moving towards the M11. This actually is a drawing produced by Sir Frederick Gibbard in 1952. He got the job for designing the new town in 1945, and his report for the whole new town was 24 pages. Beautifully succinct, much of it hand-drawn. You wouldn't even see a proposal to do the job now in 24 pages, yet his report, model of clarity, 24 pages. 1952 he got some repeatographs out and went and neatened it up and produced this drawing, and this just shows how he is, as you might guess, identifying neighbourhoods which group together to form districts, and where Newhall sits in that series of linked neighbourhoods. On this site we were working directly for the landowners who wanted to develop or control the process themselves. They wanted to control the long-term stewardship of the land, and really posed 2 questions. First of all, why can't we build somewhere that people would like to visit? I'm going back 10 years here when this process started. And the second premise was that if we can develop somewhere that attracts people, then it could also attract investment. And we did a tour of places that we thought worked. I didn't think we found a single large, well, that isn't quite true. I was going to say we didn't find a single large housing development. We did. We looked at New Ash Green and 1 or 2 projects that did work. But they were largely historical examples that we thought worked the best. This is Bath. It's speculatively built housing. It still functions today. It's got flexible uses, a successful public realm, shared surfaces, would fail Part M, but I think still pretty good. So, in a way, that slide there was a model for what we wanted to do, but to do it in a contemporary way because we'd be building in the 21st century in a new town. All the master planning we do is done by modelling. We normally model at 1 to 500, so they're quite large models, and once the street alignments are worked out from the landscape and the ecology reserves, We're then modelling in bits of foam on with individual plots to test out the design. These models are then photographed from the top, all stitched together in Photoshop, and then we get a drawing. So the first drawing we get is a photograph of the model. A bit more detail on the model. This is the phase that's currently being built on site at the moment. Should be finished towards the end of the year. Getting a little bit more precise here with the master plan for engineering purposes. So this amount of work is being done before we start producing the design codes. Now the design codes are transmitted to the developers through Covenant, so they are attached to the land sale. So we've in theory got DC powers through Covenant. There are 3 volumes to the codes. There's the codes proper, which I'll look at here. They are accompanied by public realm design standards and specifications. This used to be in the codes, but frankly we had so many problems in the public realm, especially where it joins up, where each developer hadn't done exactly what was wanted. We decided to remove that amount of discretion. We also found that developers would go to highway authorities and say, you don't really want to go along with all this design code, let's just put the roads in as we usually put them in, shall we? So developers now only go along to the meetings with the county engineer, escorted by an urban designer, so it makes sure that doesn't happen. The third volume that's attached to the sustainability standards, which are revisited now quite regularly. The standards we set, which were way ahead of the building regs 10 years ago, have been superseded twice over, so they are continually being revised and updated. Just to show you one particular brief, this is a little part of the first phase. The total development is about 7,000 people, 3,000 houses, 2 hectares of employment, 2 primary schools, utilising an existing secondary school, convenience, shops, services. So a particular individual parcel, and no parcels are bigger than 100 plots on the residential side, is being outlined there, and actually drawing the boundary around the parcel is really key design decision. We have, on this project, we're working with 6 building typologies, not types, but typologies, and those typologies govern where the building sits on the plot and its orientation. So typically streets with close to east-west orientation would be largely terraces. Streets which are more north-south are going to be detached villas, or there'll be typologies where elevations pop up and down and they've got access for passive solar. So there is absolutely no need for regimentation of streets to achieve passive solar. You've got a range of typologies which you can make fit any sensible urban design plan. That is an extract from the regulating plan, governing one particular parcel, and again you can see devices like the thick blue line is a build within zone, so the building has to sit within that frontage. Some of the red lines are indicating where we need active edges, and there are definitions for that. The building heights there in the circles, they're all minimum. There are no maximum building heights here, they're all minimum building heights. We know how high it's possible to get because of some of the other controls like car parking, that's a challenge for the developer as architect to get maximum use out. Before we've got to that stage on the regulating plan, obviously there are exercises looking at detail in the master plan, tracking car movements. We have to know it's all going to be adoptable. Typical junctions, that's a crossroads. This was quite hard going 10 years ago when we took this for adoption. We said crossroads are dominated by cars. It's exactly the places where people on foot want to cross the road corner to corner. We're going to make those into small squares, small courts, no road markings at all. We want to plant trees in the middle of the road, and got all that agreed for adoption. Took about 3 years to get it agreed. Problem was nobody would adopt the trees anywhere on the scheme, so the Residents Association adopts trees and much of the landscape, and that's been hugely helpful, and New Ash Green has been a useful case study. I mentioned there's no controls on architectural devices at all, which is fairly common on our projects, but we do place great importance on colour and material palettes, and these are drawn up based on the work of the French colour theorist Philippe L'Enclos. This one we produced with the artist Tom Porter. And if you don't know, the technique is the premise is that all settlements are unique by virtue of their mineral setting. They have a unique chroma by virtue of their mineral setting. So the technique is to gather soil samples, lichens, fragments of buildings, and the little collage on the left, you see that, and then using very accurate colour chips, produce a palette which matches that. And there's 4 palettes on this project. There's one for floorscape, one for elevations, one for roofscape, and one for highlight colours. The little collage on the right are then photographs of built form, which intentions will have similar colour hues. So we're relying on that to link different pieces of architecture. There are certain materials which are required to be used. There's only 2 bricks allowed on the job. One's red brick, it's a handmade brick, the other one's a semi-handmade brick. If it's a slate, it comes from two quarries in Wales. The actual cost of specifying those materials is much less than 1% of the total cost of any development parcel. It's a surprisingly small amount. But the lesson, I think, is to specify it at the outset, because if you let time pass by, once the developer's got down to his last 15%, then that 1% is a lot more, bigger percentage of 15% than it was of the overall costs. Phase 1, which is approximately 500 houses, shops and some offices, is broken up into that number of land parcels. And just to explain how we parcel the land up, because most of the books you read say always draw the boundaries between plots at the back, between bits of development at the back of the plot, so you make all the joins at the back. That's certainly the way forward if you want an easy life, and for 90% of it it's probably right. But where you've got a major public space, and here's a small square that's now being built on site, we want to get the greatest diversity of architecture, so that those little red outlines there, they're showing the different architects working around that square. So we're going from Richard, in there you've got Richard Murphy working on, I'm going to have to leave the camera and point. Richard Murphy's over here. We've got ECD architects, energy conscious design working here, ORMS, Procter & Matthews up the street there on the abode scheme. This is PCKO Architects. We are doing some work for those in my practice on that area there. So we've deliberately made it quite hard here and made the joins in the public realm, and that requires much greater level of coordination and management. But that's where we wanted the diversity in this particular case. That's part of the first bits to be completed. Countryside with Procter & Matthews. One example of design code feeding through is that the streets that are quite close to where the shops and services will be, we've asked for mixed use, and we've asked that the ground floors be flexible such they could run small businesses or shops at a future date. We know it would be totally unrealistic to insist on that now, they'd just be boarded up. So they're sold as residential. The ground floor is reserved, which could be teenage flat, brandy flat, could be a business, main living accommodations on the first floor. So the detailed building typologies need to be flexible enough so that uses can evolve over time. There are rules for news courts. They must have at least 2 dwellings overlooking the news court. You have to be able to see all your exits clearly. Haven't got it right on every occasion, but broadly I think these spaces are working reasonably well. Second parcel to be built, that's PCKO's competition winning scheme, and here we ran an architectural competition, 6 practices, commissioned competition to produce designs. They had to comply with the design codes as far as the street and public realm is concerned. That's the architect's renderings. That's what you get when you instantly put a little asterisk saying landmark on part of the plan. But we absolutely loved it. It's actually duplex apartments stacked up, and we actually moved a road over to a line on that landmark. That's now built. We're just waiting for patination to happen on the copper. years construction going on. Remember, this is volume house building. The foreman on this particular land parcel, who started off saying, you know, what is all this about? Isn't this far too complicated? By the time we got to this point and the job was about to finish, he said, this is the best project I've ever worked on. An experienced guys, I know every rivet in that building, and he was really quite distraught to be leaving it. I'm pleased to say he's now remained on the project and working on a different parcel. Some of the colour codes feeding through. One of the codes insists that there's no spoil carted off the site at all, so all the spoil stays on the site, has to be turned into earthworks or sculptures. This is how to get a long walk on a pocket park. You kind of spiral up. All the water courses have to be exposed on the ground and revealed to reveal the landscape. And the process that we set out at the beginning, and again this is an older slide, is just to make the point to the local authority that the sequence would be from an urban design framework and design statement, outline application. We would then produce a master plan. We would then produce design codes. We need the local authority to agree the design code with us before it goes out to the developer and his architect, otherwise we would be in difficulty. But we agree the design code. Reserved matter planning applications are then made. They have always been approved in less than 8 weeks. A friend of mine who's a nautical engineer told me that in the British shipbuilding industry, if they're building a submarine, they spend 1 year designing it and 4 years building it. In Japan, they spend 4 years designing it and 1 year building it. I think that's the difference when you're using codes. You hope things, it's a lot of effort up front, but then you hope things will go much faster. Just some conclusions from that. If you're preparing codes or thinking of doing so, they'd be very clear whether the codes are generic or whether they relate to a regulating plan. They're very different animals. If you're calling it a master plan, make sure it really is one, and the person you're doing it for has got control of the land and you can implement it. Codes have got to be concise, they must be capable of being measured against, they must be technically competent, so as far as utilities, highways, etc., they don't trip you up. Always explain the reason for the code. We get on very well with the architects on our projects. They like to know if they're building in a new area that a street runs this way, there's a view that way, there's a square in front of them, and then they can then relate to the context. Always offer procedure to consider an alternative if someone's got a good idea because you haven't thought of it. There's no reason to ignore it. Codes are no substitute for good architects. I think choosing the architect is as important as the code. Establish the design code objectives at the outline application stage. I see so many planning applications go in with a design and action statement which promises the world in terms of design code, but once that consent is given, what comes along afterwards by way of a design code can be rubbish. You could drive a cart and horses through it. So ensure that the objectives are clearly stated and the techniques that are going to be used. Agree the code detail before any reserve matter applications are even considered. Cover that one. Time and resource, but provide speed and certainty thereafter. Be clear about the level of prescription. I'll outline our three levels. There are other ways of doing it. And beware that codes are not a panacea. They're just one tool in the box. You need to consider design champions, how the land is subdivided, and how you're selecting developers and the architect team. Thank you.